So I had this patient. No, well, it was a few patients. Honestly, it's always a few patients. It's never just one. And he had arm pain, wrist pain, elbow pain, like that kind of stuff. And the thing about it was inconsistent initially before I saw him. So maybe one day it would be here on this left side, and some time would go by and it would be the right side then, and maybe it would be, I don't know, the wrist, or it would be the fingers. But it moved around a lot. It moved around a lot for the first few weeks before ever coming in. And when that happens, we'll get to the key stuff in a minute, but when that happens, it should lead you back to the central point of the body, the control center, the fuse box, if you will, where a lot of this is coming from. And that is, of course, our spinal cord, this area all the way in there. It goes down to about L2, give or take, and that's pretty cool. So there's very much a possibility that it's not actually coming from the arm. The pain is unfortunately not a great indicator of where the issue is, because all these nerves eventually in the sensory level come back to the middle, the central point. So there'll be a spinal cord, that's that guy there, but then there'll be a whole bunch of nerves that actually extend off it. And in this case, they're forming what we might call the brachial plexus, what most of us call the brachial plexus, which is a whole bunch of nerves coming together, and they end up going into the arm. And so the thing about that is, and it goes under the clavicle, let me just get rid of some of that. Oh, that was terrible. There we go, okay. The thing about that is, what it means in reality is we can have something in the middle, say a cervical disc herniation, that wasn't it, cervical disc herniation, that makes it appear to be coming from the arm, but it's not actually. And this is exactly like the lumbar spine, sciatic nerve, sacral area, where we can have a lumbar disc herniation, for instance, or we could have, let's say, a piriformis syndrome, where that piriformis is putting a lot of pressure on that sciatic nerve, a lot of pressure there, or a lot of pressure up here, and this makes it seem like there's pain coming from the leg because it reports back to the central nervous system, but it's not actually coming from there. Personally, I would say that the gluteus max and maybe those hamstring muscles, they could be part of it too, but that's just my personal opinion. No big deal. Anyways, with this particular patient, because he was having it come from one side one day and one side the other day, we can look back to this part of the central nervous system and go, okay, what could this be? Again, disc herniations are a possibility. Facet irritation, the joints in between the spine, of course they're a possibility. In this case, what we did find was considerable tension in those scalene muscles which are coming and attaching from the transverse processes to the ribs. And interestingly, the brachial plexus, those nerves, actually run in between those muscles. And we know, again, if there's enough pressure for a long enough duration time, it can make the nerve perceive that, hey, I got a problem here, and it's coming from all the way down here, when it's really not. Now, in addition to this, there was certainly that tension, and that needs to be addressed. Certainly that tension. But we also had some problems in the radial ulnar joint, right about there, and in the carpal area, the wrist area, which is a better name for it. Both these things had their own problems. Now, right away, we have to say there was no point where anyone was hit with a hammer during this process. And I mean, leading up to it, I don't hit people with hammers. It's the worst hammer I've ever seen. In any case, no one was hit with a hammer, no steel slugs, no bash, 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 nothing like that. No impact points of any kind leading up to this. So there was no inciting or traumatic injury. And it wasn't, this is his left hand, non-dominant hand, and it wasn't as if he was using this excessively in any way. It wasn't a mousing hand, it wasn't anything like that. What we did find was exaggerated muscular tone and altered position. So, for instance, the radial head was pushed off a bit to the side. It was too far lateral, as if it had been over-supinated. We'll get to that. We also noticed that the carpal arch, the curvature through here, was a little bit too significant, as if someone had pressed it like so, pressed it inward, and those bones had essentially approximated, come together. So we have to look at what can cause that non-traumatically. That's the important thing. How do we make these things happen non-traumatically? There's actually a simple relationship between, a cause and effect relationship between what happens in the CNS, central nervous system, and what happens to the body, because they're two different areas, but they relate and reflex to each other. So the central nervous system will receive sensation, there we go, sensational sensation, exclamation point, from the body, and it will react. It will react by changing the way the body responds. This is as simple as a muscle reflex, wherein changing in sensation causes a change in muscular tone. And in fact, this is always happening. It's not just when you hit it, it's not just when you change position. There's a certain amount of this happening at all times. So the CNS will change motor or muscle tone. Now let's make that in red. We can do better than that. Motor or muscle tone. And this will change the position of joints, and it will change the sensation of those joints. It will change how those are operating, which gets fed back into the central nervous system in this continuous and constant loop of constant tension and resetting and calibration. And it's very good that this happens. It is a problem, however, when it doesn't happen right. So let's assume we have some excessive tension here. Let's assume we have some excessive pressure on these nerves, more than what's needed. And let's say, as a response, the central nervous system decides to kick up the tone. In this area, it decides to say, hey, you know what you should do, supinator muscle? You should contract a little harder than you normally would. And so what that can do ultimately is pull that radial head a little bit out of place, just because it's excessive. It's a little over tightened. Tends to be what happens. What about if it were to tell the flexor compartment, those flexor muscles, to then contract too hard as well? Reasonable response. We tend to favor flexion. This is no different. So that flexor compartment, all those flexor muscles of the wrist start pulling on that wrist excessively hard on the anterior side. And this changes the wrist. It makes it want to go this way, but all the tension through here generally pulls on the wrist bones themselves and can start to compress them, starts to pull them together and starts to pull them down. And they tend to fold up as they normally would. Again, this is not a single traumatic incident. It's a constant reflexive neuromuscular loop. And you really can't separate the nerves from the muscles at all. You can't separate them, so you have to make them work together. This is a reflex loop. It's just kind of a big one, more than is usually explained, but reasonably possible as tone changes. And all this means, ultimately, all this means is that no one individual part is without importance, because the issue with this over a long enough period of time is that these pains in, say, the wrist or the elbow area, either one, either radial ulnar joint or in the wrist, will ultimately change sensation that goes back to the central nervous system, which causes a motor effect of muscular change. Once this is established, once this loop, this reflex contraction is established, this relationship of sensation and motor effect, it is self-sustaining and self-creating. So each individual part must be dealt with unto themselves in the way they need to be dealt with. So you can't just get away with adjusting the neck. You can't just get away with adjusting the elbow or the wrist or anything else in isolation. You have to treat all of it at one point or another. This has been Alex from Simple Lines Anatomy. Man, I hope that made sense.